After the Civil War, the Southern economy was crumbling. Slavery as they knew it was outlawed. The South needed to quickly rebuild, and its reconstruction created a new stain on the country's historical trail.
After the Civil War, Georgia and all the southern states discovered, in a way that they never really would have admitted, the white people of the South never really would have admitted, that they were essentially addicted to slavery. It wasn't just that they thought it was okay, it was that their entire economic system relied on it, and the thing they'd never really fully processed was that if you took away involuntary servitude from the Southern economy, it just collapsed. White Southerners were obsessed in the first years after the Civil War with how to recreate something that looks like slavery and force black people away from exercising these new rights that they had won as a result of the Civil War.
An institutionalized prison system was a fairly new concept to the state of Georgia, but it was quickly implemented, and the dark history of prison labor began.
Black people had never been part of the criminal justice system because enslaved people were under the control of their white supposed owners, and if they broke a rule or broke a law, it was the business of the owner to punish that person. And before long, the idea emerges of that, well, rather than building prisons, Georgia and most of the southern states came up with a new system of incarceration, but it was one where rather than the state building big prisons, if a person was convicted of a crime, sentenced to a jail sentence or to a fine that they couldn't pay, the version of that was created was to sell, and that was the word that they used at the time, to sell prisoners out to private commercial interests. And so if there was a big farm that needed laborers, like the enslaved people that same farm had used before the Civil War, or if there was a manufacturing facility or an industrial place, typically a coal mine or a brick-making factory.
Along the banks of the Chattahoochee River in the city of Atlanta was the site of one of the largest brick-making companies in Georgia.
The workers there were pressed to the very limits of human endurance. And what happened at Chattahoochee Brick is one of the most nightmarish accounts imaginable, because this is this giant Dickensian industrial plant where there are millions and millions of bricks being made in this constant, almost around-the-clock kind of pressure. Huge numbers of them are being sold directly to the city of Atlanta to pave the streets and pave the sidewalks of the city.
Convicts worked some 12 hours a day and were given little to no health care to treat their hard labor injuries.
And so there's no incentive to treat these workers in any kind of decent way. So before the Civil War, a slave owner was very concerned about not killing his own workers. So he wanted his own workers to at least be fed relatively well, at least sufficiently well to survive, wanted them to be forced to work incredibly hard, harder than we can imagine today, but not to be forced to work so hard that they were injured. And so they viewed enslaved human beings the way that they viewed the mules and the horses on their farms, that these were important animals that should be taken care of, but also worked very, very hard.
The torture and terror prison workers suffered are undeniably disturbing, sparking advocates to push for the memorialization of the convicts.
We know exactly what happened there and where it is, and it represents this terrible, tortured chapter of Atlanta's history that has been largely ignored or denied. And so that's really the question, is do we seize an opportunity to change that somehow, or do we keep ignoring it, or is there something in between?
Hello, I'm Doug Blackmon, host of Crucial Conversations, coming to you from Georgia State University's historic Rialto Center for the Arts in downtown Atlanta. Joining me on the stage are Karcheik Sims-Alvarado, an American historian who teaches at Morehouse University and specializes in civil rights, Atlanta, and the experiences of African Americans over the last 400 years. Vanessa Sutherland, Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer of Norfolk Southern Corporation, which operates 19,500 miles of railroad lines in 22 states, much of it serving cities and states in the southern U.S. and East Coast. And Donna Stephens, a community activist, environmentalist, and lifelong resident of Atlanta's English Park neighborhood, immediately adjacent to the property where Chattahoochee Brick Company once operated. She's also a graduate of Georgia State University. Thank you all for being here. I really particularly appreciate that that Vanessa and Donna are here, because one of the things we're going to talk about today is this place in Atlanta where there once was this industrial operation called Chattahoochee Brick Company, and there's some disagreement now about what the future of that site should be, partly because of its really complicated history and difficult history as it relates to race and Atlanta and the development of the country. And it's the sort of question that I think Americans have been too prone to avoid talking about. And so I think it's a really good and healthy thing, and it's sort of part of the point of these sorts of conversations. But Karcheik, why don't we start with you and just tell us what you can about sort of what it is and why it would still matter. Why would this this brick factory that was at its peak more than 100 years ago, what's the significance of that, both in terms of itself, but also to Atlanta and the beginnings of modern Atlanta?
Well, when you begin to look at Atlanta, its creation, a lot of times when we think about Atlanta, we still imagine it as this booming commercial city, when prior to the Civil War, it was actually a small town. And because of the railroad coming together in Atlanta after the war, you began to see Atlanta really reconstruct itself. So you had so many individuals who came to Atlanta after the Civil War, and they're looking at the city as a way to create, to try their fortune in Atlanta. And many African Americans after the Civil War, they're migrating from the cotton fields of Georgia. But what happens after the Civil War, the same individuals who were involved in slave trading are the same individuals who are the persons in place over public works in Atlanta. So this is the individual who will begin to decide, like, the roads need to be created, the ditches have to be built. And so who are the laborers they're going to use? They're going to use cheap labor. So they began to lock individuals up and begin to exploit convict labor. Then legislation is passed by the governor, and individuals, businessmen, pounce on that opportunity in order to use this cheap labor again.
So the way the system worked, it was that if you were arrested in Georgia in 1890, that there was a pretty good chance that if you were arrested and convicted of something, that a part of your punishment or all of your punishment was going to be sentenced to hard labor, and you were going to end up in being leased out to some company, some commercial enterprise, and that once you got there, they could basically do whatever they wanted to with you. Yeah, and so Chattahoochee Brick becomes this place where, for I guess about 30 years, I think, it was one of the main places that the prisoners in Atlanta were sent. And Captain English, who you were just describing, becomes, not just a wealthy man, but the richest man in Atlanta, probably, and the mayor of the city at one point, a founder of modern Atlanta in many, many respects. But now, so Donna, you live in a neighborhood that's named after the man we were just describing.
Yes.
So when you were a kid, when you moved there, I think you told me you moved there when you were 2 years old.
Right.
Growing up, did people know why the neighborhood was called English Park, or any of that story?
No, even my father, we had a conversation recently, and he said he didn't realize that we lived in English Park. He knew that we had an English Park in our neighborhood, but he didn't realize that we had a name for our geographical area. And very few people realize who our neighborhood is, our namesake is. Yeah. So it could be complicated, and I feel like I'm lecturing you know, English Part 101.
Yeah. So when at what point did you become aware that, okay, our neighborhood, and in fact, there's a little park in it, and the park has in it a little monument, right,
Right,
to
yes.
Captain English. At what point did you become aware of that story and that it connected to this place, the Chattahoochee Brick Company?
Well, one particular day, my sister and I were just fooling around and stumbled upon Slavery by Another Name, the documentary, on television, and we were watching it, and all of a sudden, we heard Chattahoochee Brick, and we said, wait a minute. And so, being who we are, well, my sister especially, we started Googling and doing internet searches, and it was a humbling experience, but at the same time, it was horrific because, as we all know, the school system teaches you, they only teach you certain fragments of American history, and they leave out that phase. Immediately after slavery, they talk about Reconstruction, but they don't talk about convict leasing. They don't talk about how the slave codes became the black codes. Those types of nuances kind of like set a different framework. And I was really appalled at it. It was really like a kicked you in your stomach because you had to think about how many fathers and sons left one day and never came back. And, women were tormented. Like, did he leave me? Or, did he did he did he die? What happened?
Yeah.
And it could have ended up on the convict leasing.
Yeah. And people have picked up, even if it's only from the movies, like we have images of the chain gangs, that were really from the 40s and the 50s, and that was supposed to, the idea that was a really bad thing, people chained up out on the roads. But yeah, we really had lost the history of places like Chattahoochee Brick. This was a place where overwhelmingly African Americans were sent, many of whom there's reason to believe had not actually committed crimes, and certainly had not committed meaningful crimes, and then they would end up in a place like this and many others like it, and then were treated, in deplorable ways, and whipped the way that people would have been whipped in slavery, and and malnutrition and lack of medicine, and terrible mortality rates, and so it's a nightmarish kind of experience.
Really made me think more, have more reverence, more respect for my ancestors, because that added another piece to the puzzle.
Well, so Vanessa, this is sort of a grim moment to turn, but so now the way that your company kind of comes into the picture now is that the modern company of Norfolk Southern Corporation now wants to build a transfer facility, but a modern industrial facility on the site where those things happened that we've just been talking about. People may have disagreements about environmental issues or regulatory issues or whatever, but this is also a place where there's this historic question. Okay, these really terrible things happened in a place like this, and so it brings us this question of so what do we do about that? The Norfolk Southern didn't do this. It wasn't Chattahoochee Brick, but now you guys want to do something in this place, and there's some who would say, no, it shouldn't. There shouldn't be anything there because of the bad things that happened there in the past. But how do you respond to that? Both the specifics of this situation, but also just that general notion of how does a company grapple with these things that long dead people did a long time ago, but there's still some legacy of.
From a corporate responsibility perspective, you can't say that just happened in the past and expect to move forward. And part of being a good citizen, particularly now that a company like ours is moving to Atlanta to make it our home and to become a headquarters here and to be a good community partner, is you have to be willing to embrace and acknowledge the atrocities that happened. I'm going to back up for one moment and put it into the larger context that companies in this country who have a 100-year, 200-year history, even if you are sort of a legacy of the predecessor companies, first have to at least embrace that people of color were subjected to grim and brutal circumstances in order to make those institutions profitable and to build them. And while they now are in a position to help communities, as a threshold to be respectful and to be responsible means as a company, you have to start by at least embracing that. For a company like ours, as the modern company, although it's true we weren't around during and after, during the Civil War committing those atrocities, we are now a modern company who has the ability, we have the resources, we have the employees to make a difference and to be more impactful. We owe it, I think, to our employees, past, current, and future, our shareholders, the communities in which we operate. You mentioned at the beginning, we operate in 22 states. That's a lot of different geographies. If you are going to be responsible, you have to figure out, even if it wasn't you, what can you do to contribute to atone for that? You can never atone for the kinds of really brutal, sad, and difficult truths that exist in not just slave labor, but in contract labor. So what I think companies, I can't speak for them all, I can speak for Norfolk Southern, but I do have a belief that companies do have the power and resources to really make a significant shift societally and politically and environmentally. When they're good at that, they can make a huge impact. And for this particular site, this site uniquely meets a need for our customers. But more importantly, the two things that should stand out in that are that we realize and have committed to putting a memorial. I don't know what it's going to be. We're not in the memorial business. But you can't hear this kind of story when you are looking at a parcel, learn this, unearth it, uncover this truth, and not be part of telling the story, being vigilant about making it visible, making sure that it's never forgotten, and quite frankly, that it's accessible to the public in a way that starts to highlight some of the atrocities, not just simply so that we won't forget, but so that it will motivate people to be better and to be more responsible and respectful. And I think we can put a memorial at the forefront of making sure that what happened there is not forgotten, is not lost, and that we do it in a way that's respectful and socially responsible. We certainly also hope that although we could put this property back into productive use, in addition to the memorial, that it's an opportunity for us to also build other partnerships within the community. Although we're not the owner of the land on which our facility will sit, that's another entity. We've taken people out on tours. We've had community meetings about how we might be able to add a walking trail in addition to the memorial. I think the memorial is critically important. You have to acknowledge that history. You have to embrace it. And if your values, like ours, are built on integrity and respect, you'll be transparent in what you're doing and why. You'll continue to talk to people and get feedback. And you'll recognize that I recognize some want the site to be abandoned, and that is a legitimate perspective, given what has happened. But at the same time, if we can provide an opportunity for customers and other stakeholders to get productive use out of that land, and we have the resources to remediate the soil contamination that exists there and bring to light a story that a lot of us outside of Atlanta probably don't know, while trying to also facilitate some areas where there can be more of a community and spiritual aspect of a walking trail, then we are committed to doing that because we have the resources and the voice and capability to do that. And we want to make sure that part of the corporate responsibility that really, I hope, begins to sweep the country, recognizing the role that companies play, that while we are developing projects and while we are working for a national impact or regional impact, that we never forget we also have a responsibility to be respectful, to be transparent, and to be open. And most importantly, when we're doing that, to bear homage when we find out things like this in the country, because it's certainly not going to just be Atlanta or Georgia where these types of historical sites are unearthed, that we play a critical role in building, being a partner, and really bringing some light to some of these stories.
I have spoken to several members of MPUG, basically where the site is located, and none of us have been approached by Norfolk Southern. save for a brief 1-hour meeting via Zoom. No one that I know has been contacted from Norfolk Southern.
The pandemic made the Zoom meetings a little bit challenging.
I understand that.
Right, so we've had 3 meetings, and we're trying to be innovative in using Zoom as a way to hold those 3 meetings. One was about environmental remediation, because the soil contamination there is really extensive, which is it's consistent with what you would find at a former industrial site. But we wanted to be a participant in that conversation because people had questions about, well, why isn't this really safe for a park? And we wanted to lead that, knowing that we had the technical data. The second meeting we had was about the historical aspects, having engaged the Atlanta History Center and really trying to figure out how do we get the right facts for the history and then partner with people to put a memorial together that would be impactful and accurate and meaningful and hopefully visually aesthetic, was a separate meeting. And then the third meeting was for the community. And we have every intention to continue to reach out and be transparent about the process, development. Development hasn't started. It would take 18 months from the time of commencement. But we've met with city council members. We've taken people out on tours. I've been on a couple of those tours to look at where we might find space adjacent to the property for a walking trail. And so that, during a pandemic, is always going to be challenging because you want to have the touch points of being able to meet and talk to people. But we are committed to reaching out more and to being an accessible and very open company. We can't do the memorial, we can't do a walking trail, we can't be a good business partner if we don't talk to people. And we may not always agree on why one person has a perspective, but we are going to respect those and listen to them. And to the extent we find that convergence, Venn diagram, where we all overlap and we can agree to those points, we are committed to finding those agreement points and really trying to be what we consider not just a responsible company, but an honest and integrity-focused one where we're willing to listen, no matter how difficult the feedback might be, or no matter how divergent the opinions might be on the site or our engagement there.
Karcheik, it seems like this is sort of an example of how not just the difficulty in terms of the abstract, but the complexity of how do you. We have this history of, frankly, just having suppressed these bad things that happen, and the society has done everything it can to make it where a person growing up in the neighborhood next door, in a neighborhood named after the person responsible for so much of this, doesn't know that person existed or what they did. So we've operated that way in American society of let's just forget about the bad stuff, and now we're in this period, partly driven by Black Lives Matter protests and this kind of sharper sense of duty to talk about things that haven't been talked about before. But it's hard to do that. It's hard to figure out, okay, all the Confederate monuments should go, that you can take that perspective. But then but are there any exceptions to that? Are there, how far does that go? Does anybody have a legitimate defense for any of this? Or you talk about, like in this situation, okay, there's something that needs to be memorialized for the first time, but how do we do that? What's the right way to do that? But the whole challenge of this reckoning with history, how do you put this in that, and what do you think about that?
I love the work that I do. I tell people I'm in the business of truth-telling, and I like sharing that truth doesn't care who it hurts. The truth is the truth. And it was really challenging, just as a historian, going back to look at this history, because it's so tragic. And the more you dig, and I'm getting a little emotional, this has been one of those subjects where I have to take breaks from it because I find myself becoming very emotional when you think about the conditions in which people endured. And, with the brickyard history, you have these reports that exist. I mean, this, which is very different from slavery. You may not get an actual true picture of what went on in the day-to-day lives, but with those who were enslaved. But with the brickyard, you have both blacks and whites who were coming together almost every single year and they're complaining about the conditions of those who are still remaining in bondage. And the brickyard was created just a few years after slavery was abolished within this nation. And then you still have people who are still practicing a labor system that was inhumane. And you would think, okay, slavery has ended, people should know better. And then you think about the 13th Amendment and its creationist language. And the language is there plain as day that slavery can still exist and people still can be deprived of their humanity and their rights as citizens when they have committed a crime. And as you stated, Doug, is that in some of these cases, people didn't commit any crime at all, or these were petty crimes. And you begin to ask yourself, who's advocating on their behalf? And then when you really begin to look deep at just this company as an example, whether it's the brickyard or the railroad, it's the entire system that has created fortunes off the backs, the labor, and the intellect of Black people. How do we undo the wrongs that have been committed to people?
You know, in one of the classes that I teach here at Georgia State, it's called Documenting History. And every semester I have about 15 to 20 students in that class. And what we do, at least the past 3 or 4 semesters, has been that we start off learning about these figures like James English and other sort of powerful business figures, mostly white people from the early 20th century, who are not really well remembered as founders of Atlanta, because Atlanta history, the way that it's talked about commonly today, doesn't begin until Martin Luther King is born, basically, you know. And Atlanta kind of gets a pass, in my view, on everything that happened prior to the Civil Rights Movement, because Atlanta is so rightfully proud to have been the cradle of the Civil Rights Movement and the place that Dr. King emerged. And so we end up focusing only on that, you know, and then and kind of obscuring that, go a little further back in time, and Atlanta's a place that really wasn't particularly different, kinder in its race relations than any other place. But so with the students, we look back into that period of time, and we end up taking from research that I've done, where I've pulled the names of hundreds and hundreds of individuals who were imprisoned at Chattahoochee Brick, and then the students take some of those names and begin to try to identify those people and, you know, try to figure out who they were. We're bringing them back to life. We're saying their names again for the first time in 100 years or 120 years. But it is remarkable when you get down to that level. And some of the people that we've excavated from the past were criminals. You know, they were bad guys, you know, who went out and clearly did bad things, got arrested for it, got sent off to this really tough place. They probably shouldn't have been treated the way they were treated, even as criminals, but at least they had broken the law. They had injured somebody to end up there. But then you find all these other folks who it's very unclear why they're here, you know, why they're there. This past semester, I had a student excavate. It was a marvel that he took this person's name, and we eventually figured out that the way he had ended up at Chattahoochee Brick was that he lived on a farm. This was in 1900. He lived on a farm out in rural Georgia, and the word had gone out among African-American farmers and farm workers in that part of Georgia. The word had gone out that there was land in Mississippi, and that Black men could move to Mississippi and farm land there in a kind of freedom that they had only, by 1900, had just been a fantasy, you know, that we could actually go there and live lives of some kind of independence and not be under the thumb of white people the way that we are here. And when the word of that spread out through this one part of Georgia, suddenly thousands of African-American men and their families were swarming the trains. You know, it was like the prison door had opened, you know, and these people who had been so horribly oppressed were swarming, you know, to get out. And in the midst of all that, and then you have the sheriffs of Georgia are mobilizing to stop this, because what the white people don't want is all these Black workers leaving Georgia. And so there ends up being this scene, you know, in a town, in a train station where, where you've got thousands of black people trying to escape Georgia, and all these sheriffs are trying to arrest people, and white landowners are showing up and trying to talk people into going back to these farms where they're still living lives as slaves. And in the midst of all that, some sort of a fight breaks out, and shots are fired. And actually, almost all accounts indicated that this one prisoner we were looking at was defending himself when he fired a shot, but he shot somebody, in the midst of all this. And so then he was convicted of murder within like a day, just this incredibly, and now suddenly he's at Chattahoochee Brick, at this place where the accounts of what then happened to people are so grim, and the children who were there, very large percentage, very meaningful percentage of the prisoners were under the age of 16 or 17, and there were certain tasks that required tiny fingers, and so you always had at least that many young boys who were there, and the constant use of the lash, people being whipped to death, people being sold at the gates. I mean, what about the idea of Vanessa, that maybe what happened in this place is so bad that there should be nothing there, that somebody has to bear the cost of that, but is it possible that places like that, we should just say, okay, nothing can ever be there?
That is a legitimate perspective, and I know that there are very strong emotions and feelings about that. To echo the point a moment ago, the entire country was engaged in this process. Yeah. And so the struggle for us, if your philosophical bent is, okay, we also want to make the land productive in today's world and to have people using it, developing it, then the question becomes not a lack of use, but how are we making it more well-known what has happened in the country? I would take a step back and maybe hypothesize or posit that part of today's severe and significant racial tensions is because there are large percentages of people who don't know the stories that the four of us are talking about right now. And so it's people are, oh, you're so emotional, and oh, you're always focused on history. Oh, why are you living in the past? But when you ground it, and whether it's a memorial or something else, when you tell these stories through book, film, not a 150-word plaque, by the way, monument, photo documentary, they are impactful. They are impactful enough to change the way people behave and feel and allocate their dollars. If I have to put it in a corporate perspective, from that larger context, I would say, if you're going to have this particular property developed, then you would want it to be developed by somebody like us, who we try to get it. We're not perfect. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of evolution to be had. But we are grounded in our corporate values, which are respect and integrity and diversity and inclusion. And as we're trying to build a workplace that's more inclusive and a customer base that's more, community focused, and the reason we want to partner in this community is we want to have this kind of dialogue. It's a hard conversation. It's emotional and it's sad. But the only way you ultimately make change is to engage in the hard conversation and to remind people why we're here today in the situations that we're in, socially, politically, et cetera, is a direct legacy of what happened not that long ago.
There are, even more places where the legacy of the past racial practices of this country, that there's still some tangible, concrete thing that reminds us of once what happened there. And as time goes by, some of those places are, like Chattahoochee Brick, begin to, for whatever reason, be discovered, and it restarts this conversation.
Fort Bend ISD deciding tonight how to pay to move the remains of former African-American prisoners buried on a district construction site.
We've been following the so-called Sugarland 95 for more than a year now. Channel 2's Bill Barajas live in Sugarland with what the school board is deciding.
Well, the Fort Bend ISD school board is currently in executive session. They are asking for more than $50,000. The discussion centering around moving the remains of 95 African-American prisoners found buried at the site site of the new James Reese Career and Technical Center. The remains were found last year by construction workers and are believed to have been there for more than 100 years. The Texas Historical Commission says the remains were ex-prisoners who were forced to work on a plantation after slavery had been abolished. Some as old as 70, some as young as 14. Earlier this year, Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill allowing the county to own and operate the cemetery. Since then, the district and county have been working to figure out how to move the remains. Fort Bend ISD knows it's a delicate issue, but plans to memorialize the Sugarland 95.
But here we are, it's over in Texas, and people are being forced to labor on these sugarcane plantations, the same plantations that had been slave plantations before the Civil War, the same owners, literally the exact same people resurrecting a kind of slavery, and all kinds of people dying under terrible circumstances. Sugarcane is actually probably the most terrible thing to have to be involved in the harvesting of any agricultural plant that exists. Those places exist, all over the place. Around Birmingham, Alabama, there are vast burial grounds that you can tell, they're all lost into the woods and all that, but places where there were hundreds, thousands of people were buried, lost to their families. But so this notion, though, of the physical legacies of these terrible events just won't go away. Like you said, history doesn't care who it hurts, but history is just going to talk. It's just not going to be quiet.
I always say that the dead is never dead. And I'm a spiritualist. And sometimes in our work, the ancestors have a way of speaking to you. They want to be documented. They will find a way to surface. And sometimes you can be doing research and a book or something will literally land in your lap. A page opens up, you've seen this, and you see the names of people, and they want you to tell their story. Yeah. They want their names to be called. Then there's other ways that history just kind of surface. And because I believe that I believe in karma, and I believe in justice, and so sometimes the ancestors on the other side are going to ensure that they get their justice, just as in the case of Texas, when this gentleman was told no, that the dead is not present in the field, and then they start digging yeah. And all these individuals surface, right? And it's starting to happen and more often than not, and so. So when you think about a place like Chattahoochee, you ask yourself, where were these individuals buried? Okay, and what became of all those bodies? You mentioned that people are buried off on the side of the woods, and that's true. When you see highways, you better believe that there are people who are buried on the side of the road. That has been my experience just recently in a neighboring county, where over 150 bodies of individuals who never saw freedom, their bodies were found off on the side of the road. And then I brought it to the county commissioners, and then one of the county commissioners said, I heard you were inquiring about this. I went to another spot. It's 150 where I'm at. Mm-hmm. So now we have 300 individuals. So whether it's plantation labor, convict labor, it's the same thing. But the dead is never really dead, and they find a way, they find individuals to help tell those stories. And then once you're presented with that opportunity to humanize this individual, as you've done within your classrooms with your students, you kind of feel obligated in order to make the deceased whole. But how do we actually go about doing that?
Donna, what about in terms of if we went out looking for people with direct connections back to the bad events that happened at Chattahoochee Brick? You've sort of thrown that question out publicly and on Facebook, sort of opened the door to, are there people out there who know that they descend somehow from somebody who was one of these convict prisoners? And basically, the answer has been that it really is it's almost impossible to find those descendants, right?
I took a class at Georgia State, Black family, where we had to do our family history, genealogy. And it was very troubling for me because a lot of my classmates couldn't go beyond their grandparents because of whatever reasons, racism, family records, just we don't talk about that person anymore, those types of things, they get in the way. And so while you can't go up the tree or down the tree, you can go left or right most of the time with African American history. And that is one of the problems with the history of finding out who the descendants are. For instance, if my husband left in the morning to go to town to get some supplies and he didn't come home, I don't know whether he had another woman in another town and decided to live with her, or he fell and died, or I don't know what happened to him. And most of the time, we're talking about a group of people who were very disenfranchised, mostly uneducated. I'm pretty sure they didn't give them paper and pen to write a note to say, dear wife, I'm in such and such jail, take care of the kids.
Also hadn't given them a school to learn to read and write in either. Right.
So that's one of the issues that we have is, in a lot of families, as I've already said, you just didn't speak about those. I don't know of any family that can say that they didn't have that occur. My father has an uncle that one day he just went missing. And when I initially heard of it, I thought that was kind of weird. But then after I heard about convict leasing, I said, could he have been a convict? Could he have been picked up on those charges? I mean, those types of things will come into play when you think about African American history, period, in America. How people just go missing. I mean, we unfortunately do hear a lot of that.
Though there also are these accounts, because the way that all of these practices finally came to an end at Chattahoochee Brick was that in 1908 there was a big controversy and there ended up being public hearings about these things that had been going on, and a call was put out that members of the public could go down to the state capitol and sort of testify, just tell their stories that related to these practices. And amazingly, it still kind of blows my mind that I don't really understand how this could happen, actually. But there were all these African Americans who showed up and started telling their stories, including one woman who arrived and told the story of how her 15-year-old son had been snatched away and vanished, and that she went on this quest to try to find him. And it's this just unbelievable story of her traveling, on foot across the state of Georgia, and finally finds her son, in one of these terrible places, so brutally mistreated that he's paralyzed on, half of his body, and then he testifies, and that's also one of the things that's unique about Chattahoochee Brick, is that there is sworn testimony that still survives from so many of the people who were both injured there, but also people who worked there, and from, Captain English, James English, the testimony from him. And the one thing we haven't specifically said is that he did become among the very wealthiest people in Atlanta, probably at the time, one of the wealthiest people in this whole part of the country. And he founded a bank that is still alive as part of a modern bank today. He lived in one of the fanciest houses in Atlanta, about a block away from where we're sitting right now. The building no longer exists. And the bricks that they made at Chattahoochee Brick were, they made 200,000 of them a day when they were running at full capacity. And those bricks are everywhere in Atlanta. They're under the streets, they're on the sidewalks, they're in my house, I'm sure, that was built in 1906. And so, yeah, but I'm still at a loss, to be honest. I'm still at a loss of where we, to descendants of James English. And there are some descendants who it really bothers them that people like me have come along and brought these stories up and challenged this mythic figure that they still revere in their family. And there are other descendants of his who feel a great sense of shame and guilt about what happened and kind of wish that they could figure out what to do. I'm still not, even after we've talked through this, I don't know exactly what, if I know the answer.
It's very complicated, but I will say, being the eternal realistic optimist, if there is such a thing, we're at an interesting time. So even using Chattahoochee to elevate the conversation to the systemic unpacking of what has happened and how it continues to happen. If 2020 taught us nothing, it is that now is as good a time as any 100 years ago to talk about the inequities, the lack of diversity in decision making, whether that is in a corporate level, community level, political level, academia, and we are really at a point where I think those areas can converge to try to deal with the complex questions of, do we have new ways and new tools to deal with the history, to honor the deceased, to continue to move forward, whether that's socially or, you know, from just a country perspective. I don't want to say societally, but to take the elements of stakeholders who really can try to brainstorm and collaborate to develop solutions that we can all buy into. This is as good a window as any to try to do that. And I think it's going to be hard. It's a very emotional topic. It's a very politically charged topic, but it doesn't have to be, because doing the right thing is not a political issue. It's a mandate. So I'm, in some ways optimistic. I'm sure that there's a lot of hard work ahead, but when you have people willing to have this kind of conversation to brainstorm about how to approach resolution and honor and memory, I think, quite frankly, it will inform subsequent conversations, because I think ignorance, lack of awareness of these issues, lack of awareness and appreciation of how grim some of these circumstances have been, is what fuels people's arrogance and apathy. So that's my thought on that.
As I was pulling together some notes and thinking about what we might talk about, and I pulled out a binder that has the newspaper coverage of those hearings in 1908. And I noticed something in a story that I had not seen before. Another witness showed up, testified about this place, another camp, not Chattahoochee Brick, and these very, very terrible conditions that were going there. These were abuses that were happening to convicts who were employed along the line of the Southern Railroad. And that's the Southern of Norfolk Southern, I believe. That's one of the predecessor companies to Norfolk Southern. And so and that's no surprise, that entities that became a part of what is today the modern corporation were engaged in using convict laborers in these sorts of ways and in slavery before. Donna, what do you think that can Chattahoochee Brick, is there a way that it could, that site could have some sort of modern activity that goes on it, and at the same time also memorialize what happened there?
I'm a member of several groups here in Atlanta, most of them environmentally focused. And there's the Trust for Public Land did a study, the Chattahoochee Greenlands, and in the table of contents, there is Proctor Creek and Chattahoochee Brick Company are addressed.
And Proctor Creek runs right by through the property.
It empties out into the Chattahoochee on the property line. And the need for green space in Atlanta is monumental. And that is almost because when they shut down operations, it's been vacant. And I've been on the property a few times over the past years, and it's amazing how nature has regenerated itself. But some Proctor Creek stewards did a study with the USDA a few years ago in Proctor Creek, and they came upon some microvertebrae that they thought were extinct, that they were no longer, available. There's also the need for native plants, and again, we can't live without water. We can live without money. We can live without buildings and monuments and things of that nature. So I would like to address it as an environmental justice issue more so than anything else at this time, because it covers a plethora of these topics that we discussed today and some things that we haven't considered. And I understand we need economic development, we need production, we need productive societies. But the quality of life, there was a feasibility study conducted a few years ago for MPUG, just so I'm not saying it's just right in that area. For whatever reason, someone decided that we would be the center of all industry. So there's a lot of cement, concrete, steel. When you look at that feasibility study, you want to cry, because everything bad is 70, 80, 90%. Everything good is below 50%. There are the air pollution, the water pollution, and the soil, the walkability scores, but then cancer, diabetes, obesity, those things are through the roof. And the argument is a lot of times, well, it's already industrialized. What's this gonna hurt? But then you have to look at the population that is currently living there and say, and ask yourself, do these people deserve this? You know, there's not a lot of opportunity. A few years ago, I had a friend, he was looking for a job, and all the jobs were in Alpharetta and places like that. And my niece was a teenager, and she ended up with a job in Northport Mall. It took her 2 hours to get to work on MARTA. And that meant 2 hours to get home. We deal with those types of things. They are, the door is constantly closing on a certain population that is primarily Black, it's primarily in the lower socioeconomic level. Affordable housing's issue. I attend quite a few neighborhood meetings, MPU meetings, environmental meetings, and the topics, while we're there for, per se, water, but we also have to address all the other issues that come along. Why did we only have 20 people show up when this neighborhood is full of people? Well, they had to go to work. They didn't have transportation. They didn't have childcare. So we have to look at those things. And in a way, what happened at Chattahoochee Brick kind of reflects those issues, because you can't separate those things. And while we don't have that blatant disregard for human life that Chattahoochee Brick created, we still have a blatant disregard for human life today when we don't address issues that fundamentally affect people. The need for, you were addressing basically quality of life issues. And because I've lived in the area so long, I've seen where you could have 3 or 4 grocery stores on the same street side by side and all of them do well. But everything has declined in such a way that we don't have those things anymore. So it's just crazy. I mean, it's just crazy to me how we have to reinvent ourselves, basically.
And I think you've just articulated in a really powerful way, just like the conversations that so many of which were prompted by what happened in 2020 and what happened last summer, of this idea that people finally asking themselves, or a company asking itself, or an institution asking itself, is it enough that we just don't do the bad things that used to happen in the past? Or a person like me saying, is it enough that I don't use the racial epithets that my grandparents did and great-grandparents did? Is it just enough to to not be Chattahoochee Brick anymore, but because the legacy of this terrible past is as much what you just described as it is that there might be some bones in the ground out of Chattahoochee Brick of people who were abused. I think you captured that. Well, I don't think that we have arrived at the absolute solution to how to reconcile all of this.
I have a recommendation.
Let's
Doug.
hear it.
And this is why it's so wonderful having us to come together and have these type of honest conversations. You have to ask yourself, how do you make the living and the dead whole, right? So as we're talking about how do you memorialize these individuals or this event, you just beautifully articulated the challenges that people in the community are grappling with every day. Getting food, having access to water, breathing air, the type of houses you live in, accessibility to resources, right? We all know that this area will be developed, but for whom?
Exactly.
Okay? So how can we live in a world, you know, I'm a big, people get scared when I say the R word, reparations. I'm a huge advocate of reparations, okay? And I don't apologize for that. And so, exactly, and a lot of times when we think about reparations, we think about slavery. But if you just look at Jim Crow, if you can look at all those individuals, even in a place such as Chattahoochee, you think about the labor and that was taken from these individuals, okay? They would never be able to get that back. Their labor was taken away from them. Their self-development was taken away from them. For some of these individuals, they may not even have the opportunity to even have children, to get married, because they remained in bondage forever. But in listening to you, and listening to you as well, Vanessa, when I imagine a type of memorial and thinking about the things that's needed for communities such as yours, imagine how wonderful it would be if you had green space created where people can have a certain quality of life, where they can breathe clean air. You could have a water memorial, a clean water memorial. You can plant trees to represent all those individuals who remained in bondage, you know. So memorials doesn't necessarily have to be bronze markers. It can be trees, it can be green grass. And at the same time, I'm all about economic autonomy, okay? How wonderful would it be if banking institutions said, in order to provide housing, quality housing for individuals, to allow them to have economic autonomy, is to allow them to have guaranteed loans that's lower than the annual percentage rate, that will allow African Americans to have. I see your whole posture just changed, right?
And it's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
What you're saying.
And we still don't lose anything. We have to undo, just like you just said, we have to undo the way that we've done things before. Sure, you can't say these things anymore. Can't practice labor in this way. So how do we take this moment from all that we've learned from 2020 and get on the side of right? So.
And that's why it's not just enough for companies and communities to say, well, I'm not the one who did that. Yep. That's why it's not enough, and why you have to be more proactive.
Well, I think we've uncovered some interesting questions. We've wrestled with some other ones, and I think this has been another demonstration of a crucial conversation and why we have these conversations. Appreciate the three of you joining in this one. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.